Hot Water History, episode 163, fresh off the bye week, our first bye week in almost 3 years. Richard, what's going on?
We'll have to make up and compensate for that. It was a technical problem, just had a computer fry. Now we got new and upgraded equipment, so we should be good to go for the next 3 or so years.
Yeah, it did feel weird not having a podcast go to full week without getting what we need to off our chest.
Yeah, it reminds me of skipping a few hockey practices when I was in school and playing, and you get back on the ice and you're like, "Oh, this is just a little bit odd just from not having that repetition and constant skating and working on skills."
But it did give us an extra week to prepare for tonight's episode and then another week for Oak Park to continue to be Oak Park, which we'll talk about a lot later. But we wanted
Right.
to do the second. I want you to, I know you have a ton of back end research because you're the one that brought up the topic,
Hmm.
but the second version of our Dark Notes series, which, if you didn't listen to the first one, To Kill a Mockingbird was our first episode. And what we did, and kind of the theme of Dark Notes, is to play on the word Spark Notes, where you don't have to read the entire book, but you get the, would you say, black pilled, red pilled, the side of the story that goes beyond the actual story. Your response to Dark Notes may be you're thinking about this a little too deep, right? Or you
Sure.
might say, well, most people don't think about this deep enough. Maybe that would be our response to this. But what's our second? Give us our second topic on Dark Notes. What is it? What are we
So
talking
our
about?
second book and featured work for Dark Notes is a rather, well, one could call it less than popular history, but an obscure book, but one that was something that drew my interest right away when I looked deeper into the subject matter, and that is this book. It's called Wolf of the Deep, Raphael Semmes and the Notorious Confederate Raider, the C.S.S. Alabama by Stephen Fox. So, why do a dark notes on this? Well, it just so happened that I was reading the book and I thought we might go into a deeper analysis, at least a type of hot water history investigation and analysis of what are the story, the history of a subject matter that's even in the most, I suppose, comprehensive courses that you might take or studies of the Civil War, the subject of the Confederate States Navy rarely, if ever, comes up. In fact, I would almost go so far as to say that if you asked someone, even if they were a self-professed Civil War buff, what went on in terms of the naval engagements between the United States and the Confederate States, they would limit their answer to and the response to the ironclad battles, the Monitor versus the Merrimack. And that's essentially it. And yet, what they'd be missing is this immensely important figure, Raphael Semmes, who was, as nearly all Confederate commanders, both on land and at sea, formerly in the United States military, now assigned to defend what they considered their homeland, their home state, their respective home states. And it was Raphael Semmes who took up this responsibility and commission as a Confederate admiral. And he was the man responsible for leading the C.S.S., the Confederate States ship Alabama, on these raiding missions to really thwart, destroy, frustrate, and at times altogether curtail out of absolute fear that they might be hit by the Alabama U.S. shipping, that is to say, Northern Union shipping and commerce, which was one of the real strengths of the Northern and Union economy.
Okay. And I remember, it being in your history class and obviously you having a more controversial take on the
Hmm.
Civil War versus, your average history teacher. I guess where does he come into play in the broader scope of American history? Why haven't we heard about this? Why haven't most people heard about this guy?
Well, it's going to sound cliched, but the most both terse and but yet accurate and I assume unsatisfactory but yet satisfactory answer would be that the victor gets to tell the story. And rarely is it brought up, nor is it something of a mark of honor that American, again, I'll say Northern or Union shipping and commerce was being choked off and throttled back and compromised by this Confederate ship. I mean, remember that the narrative that you're supposed to take from the Civil War at all times, especially in establishment textbooks that are the real textbooks that are basis of the curriculum that the base are part of any U.S. history class in the United States, is that the South really had no chance, that it was a fait accompli, that nothing was going to prevent ultimate victory by the Union, and the Southern attempts to win for itself, the Confederacy's attempts to win for itself independence, were mere, uh, I suppose, prayers, if you will. They were irrational, exuberant actions that were nonsensical. They weren't planned out. They weren't well orchestrated. And yet you have this man who was really the fear of the high seas. Fear, he was the man dominating in the high seas because of his exploits. The reason that we want to, I think it's a great book to dark pill, is because whereas Stephen Fox, who's a great freelance historian, I give him a lot of compliments in my analysis of his craft in this book. He tells a good yarn. He's really well read. He's very well sourced. His research drew him to reading Raphael Semmes' autobiography, any of his letters in a collection that is still available for people. He went even through court documents, newspapers, diaries of shipmates of Semmes and rivals. So it's a pretty exhaustive history of the exploits of the C.S.S. Alabama. And halfway through the book, I was really taken by how much it appeared that Fox, as the historian, was complimentary of Semmes, not just in his nautical and his ability as a seaman and as an admiral, but also he seemed to be speaking of Semmes as someone who had a consistency of outlook and principle. And then it's almost as though, and I've seen this before with Northern historians, and by the way, Fox is from Indiana, but he has his doctorate in history from Brown. So he's an Ivy Leaguer. That there's this kind of romanticism as they talk about or write about, in somewhat bibliographical terms, figures within the Confederacy. And then it's as though there's this call in the back of their heads that said, no, I have to condemn this at some point. I'm sounding too complimentary. I'm sounding too much as though I have an affinity for this figure. And therefore, I have to come out at some point within this work. And for him, it was about two-thirds of the way, where I have to express my good anti-slavery. I'm not a racist. I'm not a Confederate secessionist, bona fides. And it strikes one as pretty forced in this book and a bit artificial. Although and that's not to say that Stephen Fox is not convinced of his analysis of the meta narrative and causes of the war. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that what is pretty evident to me is that he did feel compelled, this compulsion to include a, and I'll read part of the book where he really steps on this um, when it's appropriate within the episode. But should we talk a little bit about who Semmes was? And
I wanted to talk about his faith life.
yes, well, and I have to admit that the reason that I became interested in the subject of Raphael Semmes was because he's a Roman Catholic. And
From
another
Maryland, too.
from Maryland, yes. So, yeah, his family was connected to the Carrolls. So, we're talking about the earliest Catholic families that inhabited colonial Maryland as a Catholic colony in the 17th century. And he would eventually become a loyal son of the state after whom his ship was named, and that's Alabama. And up until 2020, interestingly enough, there was a Raphael Semmes statue in downtown Mobile that has since been removed and taken to the museum,
I saw that.
right? Furthermore, there's a neighborhood in Mobile called Semmes, so still named after him. So he was and has been for several decades, many decades since the Civil War, viewed as a great patriot of the South and a very loyal and noble son of Mobile, Alabama in particular.
And he also fought in the Mexican-American War,
Yes.
too.
So, not unlike, again, many of the names that are more, well, have a greater renown and resonance to people today, whether it's Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson or uh, Ulysses S. Grant or Robert E. Lee. These commanders, almost all of them, Albert Johnston, Albert Sidney Johnston, Joseph Johnston, these commanders, Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, who's my that's my favorite, another Catholic, by the way, but another great name within Civil War history. They gained experience in the Mexican War, and not only did Semmes fight within the Navy, but for a time he actually was called upon to abandon his ship in, I believe it was Veracruz, and then accompany Winfield Scott's army and forces inland to the interior of Mexico during the war. So this is a man that, the other wild thing that maybe it's because of my Midwestern upbringing and stuff like that, I have this immense respect for these guys who go out at sea in just the absolute, I suppose, I mean, and maybe this would deem, you could count me as a landlubber here, but to go out into the ocean and just the just dark, stormy vastness of that, and that just the adventure that's involved, but the real gumption and courage and the temerity to do that. I it's just it's inspiring that he was able to do this. And I should note that his exploits as a raider, we might even touch upon this a little bit later. I mean, it took him during a 2 year period everywhere from the Azores off the coast of Africa to the Caribbean, all the way around to South Africa, where he was intercepting Union ships. Then into the Indian Ocean, he went all the way to the East Indies and docked at various places and ports. What's another thing that's never brought up in Civil War and greater survey U.S. history classes is that where he went, he was often celebrated. So he received a hero's welcome because of not just the stories that were being disseminated and spread throughout the papers of this. Another thing that's kind of fascinating about the Civil War too is rarely do, maybe because we're so insular in our analysis, is looking at world reaction to it and how both the Vatican, even nations like France, British colonies, but also Great Britain, were, especially in the initial stages of the war, so immensely pro-Confederate. It's just, it was quite obvious that they were working on behalf of the Confederacy. Now, Britain had a vested economic interest in that because it was Britain's textile mills that depended upon Southern cotton to fuel them. But there was a real sympathy there. I mean, Charles Dickens, for example, was an ardent supporter of the Confederacy. People don't know that.
Yeah. What else about his personal life? Anything, or do you want to
Well,
talk about
it's
what?
fascinating in his personal life too. Not only was he a Roman Catholic fighting within or for a confederacy wherein Catholics were looked at as oddities, although his political and patriotic allegiances, I suppose, allowed people to look past his Catholicism at the time. Uh, he married a woman who was not Catholic, Anna, and eventually he sold her family on getting him to allow to be betrothed to Anna. She converted to Catholicism, was a very faithful Catholic, mostly throughout her life, although she had an extramarital affair while he was at sea. Uh, when he was on, it wasn't during the Mexican-American War, but after at a commission just shortly thereafter, and bore a child outside of wedlock. How they dealt with that is quite the story too, about how there was obviously a reconciliation and a forgiveness, a pardoning of that transgression, because they remained together until Sem's death, much later on in the 18. I think he died in 1876, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, um, it was a it was a life that took him to a lot of different places, and he, in his personal life, he was always a devout Catholic. I love the fact that he was, and Fox touches upon this too, that when he would go into port anywhere, he'd seek out a church for the sacraments or mass. So he was firmly committed to his faith, and I think of him as someone who I was touching upon earlier, that the adventure and the gumption of the courage that and resolve, the fortitude, yeah, that it must take to go out on the high seas. Um, he always seemed to know where he was. Fox talked a lot about that his precision with using the various instruments for global positioning and navigation, he was always he was excellent as a mariner in that. But I also saw that as a reflection of his moral character. He seemed to know exactly where he stood all the time, and he was an ardent and consistent Confederate. And he was vociferous and passionate about his defense about the cause of the Confederacy.
I think now's a good time. I know you had some slides to share because if people aren't
Well,
a little
if I could
scandalized,
touch a little bit more upon before we get to the slides, I'd just like to touch upon what he well, going back to the book and what Fox does with it. I love the inclusion of things that are sort of curiosities within the book. So, for example, did you know that by and large, one could credit of all people, our neighbors to the north, the Canadians, should be thanking Raphael Semmes. Do you know why, Charlie?
no.
The connection between Canada and Raphael Semmes, this Confederate admiral. Well, as it turns out, Raphael Semmes was so successful in raiding, destroying, sometimes burning, but often absconding with Union cargoes. And these Union cargoes, these ships contain gold and bullion. Others contain whale oil, rare woods, cotton, resources, food, you name it. Okay. That the estimates for the bill were so high that post-war, indeed in 1867, the radical Republicans in Congress were not just vocal, but they were drawing up legislation to attempt to annex by force Canada in as in compensation for all of the raiding that the Alabama did, so as to punish Britain because the Alabama was created in Liverpool. And so James Bullock and these other men who were responsible for building this warship in secrecy in the ports of Liverpool and the shipyards of Liverpool, and then had to sneak it out, by the way, in the dark so as to evade Union recognition. And then Semmes reconnoitered and rendezvoused with them in the Azores. So he was on board another ship, and then he took command of the ship in the Azores. It was just so wild. But the Union government was just obsessed and incensed with this idea that the British had been cooperating with the Confederacy, and thus the Americans had claims against the British. So they were starting to draw up legislation to forcefully annex Canada. Well, in order to prevent and preclude that from happening, Canada moved to federalize and then to gain independence as a dominion.
Wow.
Isn't that wild? The connection? Another wild connection. There was only one Marine who was aboard the C.S.S. Alabama. His name was Beckett K. Howell. Now, those of you who are history and Civil War buffs might recognize that Howell was the maiden name of Varina Davis. That was the first lady of the Confederacy. Varina Davis married to Jefferson Davis. And it just turned out to be that Semmes' favorite shipmate and the one he got along with the most was Varina Davis's brother.
Oh, they were brothers. Okay, so
No, no,
okay.
no, no. Varina Davis is the sister of Beckett Howell.
Got it.
Okay.
So
So
in-law.
yeah, he was Jefferson Davis's brother-in-law.
Right.
Hmm.
Right.
There are other oddities. I love those inclusion of those things, those wild connections. Uh, so now, with that in mind, and having me and Charlie giving you some background about what the book is about and the biographical information, I want to talk about where the book goes wrong, goes awry. Okay, I said a wrong. That's not a word,
Can I
but
say something before? Can I
yeah,
say
go
something
ahead.
before? Well, what I love about that whole Verita Davis story is
Mm,
it just is a great example of how practical history could be sometimes.
yes,
That oh, I just really liked his brother-in-law, so we got along, and you know felt strongly about this person, and I didn't feel so strongly about that person. We sort of forget in all of the, and we talk about this in the book,
uh,
the WWEification of
yes,
history, where
right.
it's just villains and it's just heroes.
Yes,
And
and the villains always get objectified. They are pawns to be removed from the chessboard. But these are real people with real lives and deep relationships and passions and devotions. And war destroyed all of those. But war also afforded them opportunity to forge those relationships even stronger. It's kind of like a crucible and a furnace in that way.
Mhm.
So, let me go ahead and go into what I call see, I sympathize with Fox in his what I call meta narrative or analysis regarding the Civil War. And this is what I was referring to earlier, where he feels forced to make have a nod or
A disclaimer
a
almost.
disclaimer and then a disavowal of the Confederate cause because he seems too complimentary of Semmes, especially in the first two-thirds of the book. So let me bring this up and I'm going to share my screen. Hold on one second here. Okay. So, and let me go ahead and, all right. So this is what I call a very basic meta-analysis of the American Civil War. And I must also say that, and it looks as though we got the text is a little off, but we can just go with it. I must argue that this was once I would say the first 5 years of teaching US history. This was essentially my take. Now, this take, and one I share with Stephen Fox here, is certainly not the accepted analysis, right? It does even sound at times a little bit too pro-Southern, but for the perspicacious and the careful professional historian, it does allow for this admission and understanding that you can't just write off the Civil War as this noble effort by which the Union attempted to vanquish slavery because they saw it as so morally reprehensible that they couldn't continue in a political union with any region or entity that persisted with it. Okay. So essentially, the argument goes the North possessed what one might call moral authority. Now, it's important to note, and Fox does this too, so credit here to him, that this is witting or unwittingly. And what I mean by that is eventually, if you look through the sources close enough, it's pretty clear that the war, and Lincoln says this over and over again. Well, William Seward says it over again. Edwin Stanton says it over and over again that the war is about maintenance of the Union. And that, as Lincoln put it in biblical terms, in citing the New Testament, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And for him, the Union was a holy entity. It was a holy and sacred thing. So the question is, though, is that enough to justify the slaughter of 1 million of your fellow countrymen? It's not unless you come to the conclusion that all along, behind the scenes, or maybe in the back of their mind, in their subconscious, that the war would eventually become a cause for liberation of the slave. So eventually, because it becomes an objective of the war, that vindicates the earlier, I don't know, reluctance to espouse emancipation, the reluctance to espouse abolition. Okay. So it's clear that Lincoln and the GOP, that is to say the Republicans, eventually saw this is what the argument goes as saw slavery or the end of slavery as an objective in the war. And the moral rectitude of abolitionism warranted the negation of proper procedure, legal and otherwise. So it is a weird thing to consider that Lincoln throughout the war operated as a dictator. There's no real convincing argument that one could present in which he doesn't act like a dictator. He takes upon himself dictatorial powers, not just as the commissioned commander in chief under the Constitution, but he negates congressional laws, the Fugitive Slave Act being one of them, the arrest of without proper procedure and in violation of habeas corpus, Confederate officials, and holding them without trial. And then ultimately, too, even something like the advancement of the Emancipation Proclamation, which he puts under the guise of, and if you read it, it sounds like a military document, but when you consider the seriousness, the gravity of it, and the transformative nature or objective behind it, should this not have been something that should have been legislative in nature rather than executive? Or certainly not from a military diktat? One would argue so. So the idea here, and it's never one because it's a contradiction that is unreconcilable, is if the Union is so holy, and if the Constitution's so perfect of a Union, why does it have to be violated over and over again? In order to force the Southerners back into its coherence or its obeisance? Do you see the contradiction there or the problem?
I see it. Yeah.
Okay. But this is glossed over because of the moral rectitude of the final cause, not in the Aristotelian sense, but in terms of time, chronology, that slavery would be negated, slavery would be eradicated throughout the eventually reunited states. Now, from the Southern position. Notice how the emphasis there on that analysis is the North has moral authority because it wishes or is at least fighting for, wittingly or unwittingly, the end of slavery. Right. And I'll read from Fox where he talks about this. The South, it must be admitted, possesses legal authority. And when I saw this, if you look at broad scopes and broad spans of history, oftentimes mass conflict, indeed even revolution, occurs when you have this divergence in societies, where you have one party having a moral authority and yet another party arguing convincingly and properly for legal authority. And when there's a disassociation of those things or divorce of those things, that's when conflict arises. And it seemed to be for me earlier in my career that this was a fitting and interpretation. So Davis and the Confederate secessionists viewed the conflict through a legal slash rights based lens. They were reading in a traditional American interpretation of what they understood as constitutionality and the rule of law, that what the Union had done was vitiated the compact among the states because of their lack of, well, adherence to such provisions within the Constitution as general welfare through the tariff policy, their enforcement of, for example, um, mercantilist policies regarding trade. That includes the tariff. And then furthermore, not enforcing congressional laws that were on the books, such as the Fugitive Slave Act. I mean, we have to remember, Charlie, and maybe you do recall this because I did emphasize it in U.S. history in our classes. And since you saw me at the tail or more toward the second half of my teaching career, you got the full bore of my analysis. You might have gotten some of this, but then I have a much more what I would call enlightened and elevated interpretation, as you're going to see in a moment. But remember that the state of Wisconsin in 1859 officially, the legislature officially nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, I thought nullification was only just the stepping stone or on the path to secession and breakup. Like, what power does a state have to nullify a federal law? Well, Wisconsin was doing it. And the Southerners, in response, oddly enough, were saying, whoa, where is this? You told us we couldn't nullify the Tariff of Abominations as South Carolina way back in the 1820s and 1830s. But now you're nullifying an act and there's no response on the part of the federal government. So it had been building up for decades, but the culmination of this was that Southerners came to believe that they had no place within this political union and structure any longer because Northerners were no longer abiding by it, by abiding by the compact. In other words, the Constitution of 1787 enshrined federalism, subsidiarity, and yes, slavery as an institution into American life. It codified those things, not in some attendant way or accidental way, but inherent within the political union that was the United States, to which Southern states ascribed upon ratification and continual inclusion and operation within the Union. And the North broke that compact. Does that sound like your run-of-the-mill type of analysis of the Civil War and the reasons for the war?
No.
No. So but here's the better meta-analysis. And let me go to that now. Okay. And let there be light, right? This is the enhanced, much more developed explanation. Oh, wait, before we get to that, let me read from the book, okay? Because Stephen Fox has this great encapsulation right here on page 2,203 of, again, this is Wolf of the Deep. He says, bringing Raphael Semmes into the picture, Raphael Semmes was a moral paradox. Although a slave owner, he was not deeply invested financially in slavery. He operated from a clear, unselfish set of principles and denied himself comforts and even his health to serve the cause. Yet that cause, as Ulysses Grant later remarked, was one of the worst for which a people ever fought. Do you see what's going on here?
Hmm.
It's throughout the war. And if you really dive into the source material, whether it's Lincoln, Grant, any major figure within the North, correct? They're always searching for a justification for the war, a moral justification for the war, because they can't claim slavery in the beginning, especially because there's just not enough support for this war being about slavery. If you were to call upon Northerners to fight a war for the abolition of slavery in the South, no one would have supported that effort. No one. Very few, I should say. The abolitionists in the North might, obviously, they'd go on, get on board, but very few. It would be a very small minority supporting the war effort. So Semmes took the wrong action. This is Fox again. Semmes took the wrong actions for high principled reasons. Notice the dichotomy there? He took the wrong actions, but for high principled reasons. Now, I have to bring in another figure within the book, and this is Clarence Young. Now, Clarence Young was the, what would I call him? The sort of chief operations officer for procurement on the Alabama. He was a Southerner. He had been in the Confederate Navy. Okay, so he was a commissioned officer in the Confederate Navy, and he was on board. In 1860, late 1862, early 1863, Young was a very unprincipled guy. He abandoned a wife and child in North Carolina, in Wilmington, North Carolina, from my recollection in the book. And then he had an extramarital affair with a woman in Kingston, Jamaica. At the time he was having this extramarital affair where the Alabama had docked, Semmes had given him provisions to go, or given him monies to go off and buy provisions for the ship. Well, the guy went and just got drunk and went to the brothel and just wasted all the money. So when Young came back, Semmes decommissioned him. He said, "You're done. You're cut. We're off. You're dishonorably discharged," I guess we would say, from the Confederate Navy. Well, what did Young do to that? Young then went and found a means by which to engage with British agents in Jamaica in the Caribbean. He was then shipped to this is not British agents, but Union agents in the area. He was brought to London, and there he became a spy for the Union. So he was a Benedict Arnold. He turncoated. He went from the Confederacy to the Union, and then he even was appeared toward court. He was under the pay of the U.S. Essentially was the U.S. ambassador or chief delegate of the Union and the North to Great Britain in London. He received something like five. He received an allowance per month, like £5 per month. He was set up in an apartment in London, and he went to testify. And he gave exacting detail about what the Alabama was doing, who was on board, what they were attempting to do, where they might go in the future. All this very valuable information. So that's Clarence Young, just a real scoundrel of a guy. So he says Clarence Young, the brazen anti-Semmes, wound up with the Yankees in the Civil War, but in assuming that allegiance was selfish and deceiving and unprincipled. So you have Semmes being the principled, but for the wrong cause, right? For the wrong end. And you have Young being unprincipled, but for a righteous end. You see, so that's why he's the anti-Semmes according to Fox. He took the right actions ultimately for the wrong reasons. So who in the end was more admirable? You
This
know,
is in the book, or
this is in
are
the
you
book.
asking?
This is in the book. Yeah, sorry, I should say that this. Yes. So this is Fox writing. He said he took the right actions, that is Young, ultimately for the wrong reasons. So who in the end was more admirable? Charlie, I have a question for you. Does Stephen Fox ever bring up that Clarence Young had ever talked about fighting for the Union, in other words, becoming a traitor to his own country, the Confederacy, for the purpose of eradicating slavery.
I didn't hear that.
Yeah. So, in a sense, Stephen Fox really reads into the intentionality of Clarence Young to what? To justify and vindicate his treachery. Because in many ways, the end justifies the means. I mean, we're getting in very shaky moral ground and ethical ground here, aren't we? So let me go on. And this is the culminating paragraph with in Fox's analysis on this subject of the cause, justification, really the heart of the war and the war efforts. He says, and this is Fox again writing, a reasonable answer, though laden with these complicated ironies of motive and outcome, is self-evident. Semmes, by defending slavery in a nation committed to individual rights and democracy, oh, there's that word democracy again, put himself on the wrong side of history. Oh, you knew that nothing. We have different mottos, correct, in Catholicism: Ad majorem Dei gloriam, Deus vult. The progressive mantra is wrong side of history. It's just
And
it's a coverall.
dangerous to democracy.
Correct. Dangerous democracy. You're on the wrong side of history. Obama loved saying these Republicans are they're clearly on the wrong side of history. Because what that does that do? It's a caricature and doesn't, what would be the word? It removes from you the responsibility to make an argument. See, not why you're wrong logically in terms of practical reasoning, what have you, the actual application of your policy. No, you're just going to be on the wrong side of history. And we all go, oh, that guy's a Nazi. Or, oh, that guy's a genocidal maniac. You right? Because they're
Right.
on the wrong side of history. This is Fox writing again. Neither he nor any other true Confederate, then or now, can escape that judgment. When seen against the grand scope of Western history and its finest achievement, the endless struggle for freedom and self determination, the crews of the Alabama deserved to end in defeat. Wow. So there, he's obviously, yeah, he's splitting hairs, if you'll pardon the cliche there, about understanding Semmes to be a principled individual, but for an altogether unrighteous cause. And Clarence Young, the opposite or the reciprocal of that. So let's get to this much more enhanced because what the sources bear out is contrary to, and really how the United States emerged from the Civil War, as we write about in A Twisted History of the United States at great length in our Civil War chapter and the Reconstruction chapters. The facts and the situation and condition of the United States after the war is much more, it's better explained through this analysis. So, the North. The Union administration, Lincoln, Seward, you name them, right, claimed moral authority out of convenience. They didn't have moral authority. They claimed it and espoused it out of convenience when it became advantageous to bring about an end to, or hasten the end to the war or give them some practical advantage in the conflict. And if you need proof of that, I'll give it to you in a moment from Lincoln's and Davis's mouths themselves. Lincoln and the GOP, that is to say the Republicans, eventually saw that. So we're talking about Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, the congressional Republicans who were cheerleading the war effort and had been really advocating for it for long before Fort Sumter. Lincoln and the GOP eventually saw the end of slavery as a means to re-subjugate the South. Now, let me get to this source. The Emancipation Proclamation, right? I have this source here wherein, and I'm going to summarize it for you because it's rather long, but At the end of 1862, so Lincoln doesn't actually write the Emancipation Proclamation until October of 1862. And it's not going to go into law until January 1st of 1863. But before that, in fact, on September 13th, 1862, he met in the White House with a group of abolitionists from, of all cities, Chicago. They were missionary abolitionists from Chicago. And it's a weird source in that you would think that when he's meeting with someone or because he's meeting someone, there'd be some sort of dialogue or exchange. But no, it's just Lincoln kind of talking in the air. And you get the sense that these people need not be there. He's kind of coming up with a pros and cons list for announcing the Emancipation Proclamation. So I'll read a portion of it, but then I'll summarize it. He says, "What good would a proclamation of emancipation from me do, especially as we are now situated? I do not want to issue a document that the whole world will see must necessarily be inoperative, like the Pope's bull against the comet." Okay, so this is a reference to this false report that Pope Calixtus III had excommunicated Halley's comet by papal bull. That was an anti-Catholic screed. It was a myth. But Lincoln, always the Mason and always the anti-Catholic, just had to put a little shot at Catholics in, which is a little bit fitting because we're talking about Semmes going and raiding his ships as a Roman Catholic representative of the South. All right. Would word free the slaves when I cannot enforce the Constitution in the rebel states? Now, that's a good question. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation does not pertain to the slaves extant within the border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. In those areas, slavery would continue on because if Lincoln was to dare to free the slaves in those areas, those states might secede and go with the Confederacy. Is there a single court or magistrate or individual that would be influenced by it there in the South? And what reason is there to think it would have any greater effect upon the slaves than the late law of Congress, which I approved, which offers protection and freedom to the slaves of rebel masters who come within our lines? Yet I cannot learn that the law has caused a single slave to come over to us. So he's already admitting that they have laws to try to encourage the slaves as contraband of war. By the way, that's the way generals like Benjamin Butler and Sherman and others treated the slaves. The slaves, by the way, when they came across the Union lines, were seen as immense burdens to the Union generals. And when they were immense burdens, guess what they were forced to do? Labor for the Union Army as conscripts for the Union Army, not as soldiers, but as conscripts. Okay. Now he goes on to say all these things. He's like, well, he's asking himself all these questions. And then he finally says, well, you know what it might do? It'll cause rebellion because at least the hope is that, well, they'll get word of it and they'll start moving away, or they might even engage in some violent activity against the domestic Southerners. And then he goes on to say that, oh, what this will really do is at the very least, and he is admitting that this is largely salutary. It's just kind of it's words, not action. He says, well, this will strengthen our cause in front of the international courts. So, and what he means is not actual courts, but in the International Court of Public Opinion, because now the British, who had already abolished slavery in the empire in the 1830s, will have to come to our side or be less supportive of the South. Now, does that sound like a guy who's worried about the plight of slaves?
No.
Not in the least. He is a dictator who is exercising his authority during a war. He's campaigning as a general of the generals, commander in chief. So again, let's get back to there's this unresolved and apparent contradiction of defying the Constitution while aggressing for its preservation. Now, what I mean by that is, look, the cause of the war, the justification of war, time and time again, repeated over and over again by advocates in the North, was that the Union must be preserved. Above all costs, the Union must be preserved. Now, if that's again the case, and you said that this is a holy edifice that's been created, that this Union is indissoluble, well, then why are you aggressing? If it's so great, why are you aggressing to force people back into it? That's never resolved. That's never resolved. So you can't aggress against people and at the same time argue your union that it's a moral imperative to keep this union together when you're engaging in war against them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's analyze the South. And this is where and I warned people, when I taught these classes, I'm gonna sound like a Confederate sympathizer, so be it. And I said at one point, I said, "Do you know why I might sound like a Southern sympathizer during my analysis? Is because I'm sympathetic to the South as a result of my study of history." All right, so here's the South. Not the South didn't just possess legal authority. That was clear for fighting the war, but they were fighting for really self-determination, for true sovereignty. Southerners rightly understood this to be a war of nationalist and mercantilist imposition and colonization. And this is shown time and time again, to the point where when Lincoln gives his Gettysburg Address and he says all of a sudden, it's always throughout the war, he's always reaching for like a justification for the war. To keep the Union together. And it's a new birth of freedom. Well, what the hell does that mean? New birth of freedom? Huh? What does that mean? And then at the end, he says that nations ought to live, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, ought not be abolished from the earth. That's the conclusion to the Gettysburg Address. And this is what drew the real antipathy of commentators, both domestic and foreign, newspapers far and wide, when he said, that doesn't make any sense. H.L. Mencken said, and rightly pointed out, that it's blather. Nothing could be further from the truth. Who was fighting for, as by the way, in the audacity of Lincoln to say that while he's at Gettysburg Cemetery in November of 1863, and he has the temerity and real insulting audacity to say that the Union soldiers are fighting for the preservation of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And right next to those Union soldiers, they're dead Confederate soldiers. They were the ones that were fighting for sovereignty. Finally, there was a nobility in the consistency of the Southern cause's belly. And what I mean by that, there was in the Southern cause for war. Notice that aside from very brief forays into, in terms of land invasions by Lee into Maryland, which by the way was a liminal state in the war, and then of course his invasion in 1863 of Pennsylvania, which resulted in Gettysburg. Where's the invasion taking place? This is indeed a war of northern aggression and recolonization of the South. And Jefferson Davis, by the way, Jefferson Davis has a response to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And I want to read just a part of that to you. Just speak of the nobility of the Southern cause here. Um, this is what Jefferson Davis said, and you'll pardon me, this is a bit of a monologue, so but it's beautiful language. By the way, Jefferson Davis has something very much in common with you and I. Do you know what that is? He
No.
graduated from a Dominican high
Oh, I
school.
did know this. Yeah.
Uh-huh. St. Thomas Aquinas Academy in Kentucky. So this is what Jefferson Davis wrote in response to the Emancipation Proclamation. I think this bears out the Southern nobility in the cause and their moral and legal justification for their fighting the war. Jefferson Davis. In this political aspect, this measure, the Emancipation Proclamation, possesses great significance. And to it, in this light, I invite your attention. It affords to our whole people the complete and crowning proof of the true nature of the designs of the party which elevated to power the present occupant of the presidential chair at Washington, and which sought to conceal its purpose by every variety of artful device, and by the perfidious use of the most solemn and repeated pledges on every possible occasion. I love how he just won't refer to Lincoln by name, the current occupant of the presidential office. I extract in this connection as a single example the following declaration made by President Lincoln on the solemnity under the solemnity of his oath of Chief Magistrate of the United States on the 4th of March, 1861. So Lincoln's first inauguration. Remember, this is what Lincoln said before the war even starts, right? I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Right from the horse's mouth. So, Davis goes on to say, nor was this declaration of the want of power or disposition to interfere with our social system confined to the state of peace. Both before and after the actual commencement of hostilities, the President of the United States repeated in formal official communication to the cabinets of Great Britain and France that he was utterly without constitutional power to do the act which he has just committed. Again, legal inconsistency. If the Constitution's so great, why does it first permit such a heinous institution of slavery, which you codified into its very articles, right? And then why are you negating it by your very executive dictatorial action? This proclamation, this is Jefferson Davis again. This proclamation is also an authentic statement by the government of the United States of its ability to subjugate the South by force of arms, and as such must be accepted by neutral nations, which can no longer find any justification in withholding our just claims to formal recognition. It's an airtight case. It's an airtight case because he uses Lincoln's own words against him as the best Southern editors and defenders had done, both foreign and domestic. What do you think?
I loved all of this. I loved the dark age versus the new age and kind of the evolution of the lesson that you were teaching 7 years ago.
Yeah, and it just requires a willingness to where the sources and where the evidence takes you. You have to base your analysis and ultimate evaluation, your value judgments on historical periods, figures, understanding their motivations, trying to extrapolate from them, whether it be righteous or practical or just immediate intent. The the rectitude of their actions. And it just appears that why this Black Notes episode or Dark Notes episode is because I don't think Fox is willing to go there.
I know you mentioned this a little while ago about the the right and wrong side of history. I was just reflecting on how manipulative and almost demonic, I would argue,
Mm,
saying that is because it makes a god or an idol out of future people or
yes,
the
right.
majority of the future.
Well, yes, or that again, that there's a small cadre of elites that are moving history in a very Hegelian and a very Rousseauian way, always toward progression. And it's their job responsibility. It's their, we won't call it God-given, but it's their commission, if you will, to bring the rest of the masses and the unwashed masses of people that are not going to go along with it, either by hook or by crook, along with them.
Right.
Yeah, and yeah, so you can understand why Marx loved Rousseau and Hegel. There
Yeah.
it is. Yeah. Can I tell you one more very let's say, a white pill story about Raphael Semmes. Speaking of his faith and connection to it, his wife, as I said, even after that extramarital affair that resulted in the birth of their daughter, Anna Semmes, they reconciled. They had two more children, by my recollection, Joseph, a boy, and then their youngest daughter was Electra. And by all accounts, including Stephen Fox's, Electra was Semmes, well, the apple of Semmes' eye. And remember, during his exploits in the Civil War, he had been away from his family for more than 2 years. In the end, he was away from them for almost three during the war until they were able to reconcile and get back together in Alabama. And then he actually went off after the by the way, the Alabama was in 1860, late 1863, early 1864, one of the two, was sunk by a Union ship off the coast of Cherbourg, France. Semmes survived because he had so many friends with the British. Actually, British ships picked him up and his most of his officers and ferried him to London in the dark of night. And he then went to France for a while, and then with through a Confederate runner got back uh, into I forget where he went into. I think it was Wilmington, North Carolina again. And then he rejoined the Confederate Navy and fought another campaign at the end of the war. Eventually, by the way, he was after the war, he was imprisoned. He was tried and imprisoned, and then let go later on at the insistence of his wife, who went to Washington to get his release. And Andrew Johnson, the president at the time, was constantly hectored by Anna Semmes, his wife, to let him go. So he finally said, "Oh, just let Semmes go," and he went back to Alabama. But his youngest daughter was named Electra. Did I say the name
Mm.
before? What a great name, Electra Semmes. According to accounts, she, unlike the rest of the Semmes clan, did not have an active faith life. She didn't really embrace her Catholic faith. And she actually had been betrothed to a kind of con man at one point, and then she sort of woke up to that, and this is while Semmes was away, and then she broke off the engagement, and then she met another guy who Semmes eventually approved of. But the day or 2 days before her wedding, she came down with an extremely severe case of smallpox. Now, at that time, if you came down with smallpox, that was not a good sign. You were most likely going to be dead in a very short period of time through an excruciating death. And the fact that this was 2 days before her wedding was just, it threw the family into absolute convulsions. Electra apparently made every effort during her suffering with their disease in those days. In fact, in those couple of days as she was suffering from smallpox, to go to a Catholic church to receive confession. I don't know if she was anointed, but in any case, she was engaged in very fervent prayer. The day of her wedding, she woke up. She was completely cured. The doctors could not, the doctors who were servicing her could not explain it. She attributed it to a divine miracle, and from that point on was a very, very devout Catholic, which of course drew the greater admiration, love, and fealty of her father.
And that's all in the book.
It's all in the book, yeah. So it's a great read. Don't get me wrong, and you get the sense, like any good history, like you're on board the ship with Semmes and with Hull, who was his kind of vice admiral, and these guys, and Beckett Howell, and you get a sense too because they Semmes kept a diary, although he lost a lot of he actually in one venture he sent pages off so they were preserved before the ship sank. So um, by the Kearsarge was the U.S. ship that sunk him. Uh, but the Alabama was the terror of the high seas, and it really pinched American commerce to the extent that, like I said, I forget what the drawdown was in American. It was really affecting Union shipping. So
Do you want to talk
fascinating
about a
story.
town that doesn't have any statues for Raphael Semmes?
No, it does not, and I wouldn't expect any to be erected anytime soon. Now, if only Semmes was a black chemist, right?
Here it is, people.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
And
Should we go to your gay suburb now?
The People segment, Meanwhile in Oak Park, brought to you by Tridentine Brewing. We got three stories since we had a little more time. And the first one, let's start here. I think I might have taken the wrong story for this one because I definitely did. Because Ravi, our guy, got into it. He's on the campaign trail going pretty hard
Vicky?
against Vicky Skaman. Yeah.
Woo!
Did you know that? Here it is.
Ah, here we go.
Skaman
They
Parakat
spar.
sparked at Journal Election Forum. Full slate of Oak Park Village candidates spoke Monday night. Police station, Village Hall took center stage. There they are.
Oh, that looks kind of cheap. Couldn't they get a stage or something?
Well, they're spending supposedly 150 million on the new Village Hall, so we'll see if that's part of the plan.
Yeah.
Mickey Skaman and Ravi Parakat, the two candidates for Oak Park Village president, were combative Monday night during an election forum sponsored by Wednesday Journal. Skaman, the current village president, and Parakat, a current trustee, were critical of the other's position on plans to build a new police station, thoroughly remodel the current village hall, and how to pay for both projects. The event, held in the Veterans Room at the Oak Park Public Library on Lake Street, drew over 100 community members looking to hear what the candidates had to say, with a few dozen more watching from home via a live stream. Laura Matruk moderated the forum. Matruk, the former owner of the Buzz Cafe, hosted candidate forums each election season in her Arts District coffee shop. Village trustee candidates Jenna Leving Jacobson, James Taglia, Chibuke Anya, Lucia Robinson, and Joshua Vanderberg spoke during the event's first hour as the five of them compete for three available seats, musical chairs. And Via and Robinson are both current board members, while Taglia is a former board member who lost his last bid for re-election. Skaman and Parkat took the stage during the event's second hour as they both vie for the president's seat, with the losing candidate set to give up their seat on the village board entirely. Loser leaves town.
Hats are in the ring.
All the candidates answered questions touching on a few hot button Oak Park issues, including the Oak Park Police Department's staffing crunch, housing and homelessness, economic development, and the potential construction of a new police station and remaking of the Village Hall building, and of course, how leaves are collected.
Crucial, crucial issue. A
The
matter of
vil-
life or death.
The village president candidates traded barbs on the village hall issue during the longest back and forth exchange of the night. Parkat has made his vow to block any full reconstruction of the village hall building, a focal point of his campaign.
Wow.
Quote, I'm not talking about the police facility. That is absolutely required, Parkat said. The village hall is a facility where the average Oak Parker spends less than 5 minutes a year. To spend $150 million dollars on that, and $150 million dollars is just a conservative estimate.
What we've been saying all along, and meanwhile in Oak Park, that's a conservative estimate.
By the time you look at financing costs, interest, location, or the logistical shifts required to move people to a new location and bring them back, it is going to push close to $200 million dollars. And we don't have a good handle on that.
Charlie, didn't I say it was going to be 200 million?
You did say that.
Okay.
To sit here in 2025 and not have a handle on that and not know how it's going to impact our residents, that's poor governance. Skaman accused Parakat of purposefully inflating the potential costs of the combined police station and village hall in his response to make the project seem more unwieldy than what's been planned. Quote, what you're hearing from my opponent is sensationalism, Skaman
Oh.
said. We hired an architect that we truly believe is sincerely working with us and listening to the fact that we need a lower number.
Can I interrupt at the moment? Sensationalism, she has some nerve to say that he's engaging in sensationalism. This is the same woman who years ago, as a result of an offhanded joke by said Ravi Paragat, closed the meeting because she was so upset and walked out, right? That's not sensationalism.
Yeah, we'll have to go back to that story. But yeah, the meeting was adjourned because he said something. I forgot what he said.
Yeah, what
Oh,
I
it
forget
was
what.
it was a joke. Okay, so it was a story about another village where the cop shot the mayor or something.
Mm-hmm. Right. And she felt so threatened by that.
No, he said something like, "Oh, we gotta pull this up." I'm so mad we're botching this right now. The past
Yeah,
architect's numbers we heard for a new police station were between 76 and 86 million dollars. So that's the major chunk of whatever it is we're going to spend. But all you've been hearing from the board table is that we're still looking for a lower number. Putting out this
where's the lower number coming?
putting out this false information is truly not how you want your village president to operate. Parkat said the village has already spent millions on architects for the project over several years,
Oh.
and that the village can't afford to mismanage or overspend on such a big project. Quote, I'm not willing to hope for the best in the future, knowing that this decision is going to land heavily on community members and price many people out.
Mm.
The sitting village board of trustees will spend one of its last meetings together on March 18th discussing the future of the municipal campus. The village trustee candidates were mostly in agreement with each other on the issue, recognizing that a standalone police station is a need and not a want, but that the board should keep the village hall renovation to what's most necessary, namely making the building more accessible to people with disabilities. When Matriarch asked the trustee candidates who'd they support in the presidential election, only Anya was willing to go on a limb to endorse either candidate, throwing his support behind Skaman. Quote, she has always had a very good perspective on things and will continue to be a voice that I can bounce things off of and be like a mentor to me on the board, Ania said.
How is that relevant to any Oak Parker? How can you vote for a guy as a trustee like that?
Quote,
It's all about him.
Ravi is a very, very great individual. It's nothing against him personally. It's been a pleasure to serve with him, and I wish he was running for trustee again. The election will be held Tuesday, April 1st. For more information on where and how to vote and for more coverage of this candidates forum, check in with Wednesday Journal's online election coverage.
Ooh, April 1st, we're gonna April Fool's Day. We're gonna
We
really
have to have an emergency pod. Follow the 18% of Oak Parkers that went out and
come
voted
in with the
for.
dramatic music. Dun, 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 dun. We have a election call.
What if we live streamed it?
Oh, that would be cool. That would be cool.
St. Catherine St. Lucie Church closing brings complex emotions.
Wow, it's closing.
Rising costs, dwindling attendance prompts decision.
Oh, yeah, well, can you imagine?
Lower mass attendance and costly upkeep has resulted in the anticipated closure of St. Catherine of Siena St. Lucie Church.
This is so sad. What a
I,
beautiful
I
church.
know.
And not only, well, I mean, look at how gorgeous that is. And I mean, can you imagine, is that the altar that they put up there? No, that's the baptismal font. Okay, so um, that place used to be, if you were to go back just several decades, that place was booming and such a vibrant parish. I mean, it was two separate parishes at one time.
Right.
So,
The building located at 27 Washington Boulevard in Oak Park is part of a Catholic parish that includes St. Giles. Um, Building closure will occur prior to the end of the parish's fiscal year on June 30th. A final commemorative mass will be hosted in June, according to a press release made available Monday by the parish, though no official closing date has been set. While located in Oak Park, the parish has a long history as a shared community between Oak Park and Austin.
mhm.
Your favorite pastor,
Oh
Reverend
God.
Carl Morello, pastor of St. Catherine, St. Lucie, and St. Giles, made the announcement after 9 a.m. Mass Sunday. He invited the roughly 75 parishioners in attendance at St. Catherine, St. Lucie to speak to each other and him about the announcement. Quote, I could tell you then in 42 years that they
Yeah.
misspelled. I can tell you that in 42 years I've been a priest, I never imagined that I would be in a position to tell people that their sacred place was being closed, he said Monday morning. I had to pray about it. I had to struggle with it emotionally.
Hello, open your eyes, dude. I mean,
I've
it's Vatican II church now.
I've come to appreciate the community, who they are, the cultural gifts they bring, some of the things they taught me. So there is a sense of connectedness.
Okay, this guy
Eh,
talks exactly like he talks like he's a trustee on the village board.
there's a sense of connectedness. Yeah, like being a part of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, right. A sense of
What about
connectedness.
what about that one? Instead of the
Sense of,
cultural gifts they bring, what about
yeah. How about our shared faith,
Believing in Jesus Christ, the Savior
right?
of the world?
Yeah,
That part,
yeah.
the
The
press
fact that
release,
we've been made heirs in the kingdom of God through our baptism. Nope, nope, nope. Forget that.
the press release. No, it's their cultural gifts and the
Yeah,
get
yeah.
and what they bring to the community.
Of
These people
course.
are it's insane. The semantics are so important.
Mm-hmm.
You could
Mm-hmm.
really see just by different words how
Yeah.
where people stand. The press release noted that St. Catherine St. Lucie Catholic Church will remain open while the nonprofit Sister House, which offers a temporary home to women seeking recovery from substance abuse, will remain in the church's former convent building. The Neighborhood Bridge and the Faith and Fellowship Ministry will continue to operate out of the repurposed rectory. Housing Forward will have a presence there. Morelos said the church building will become relegated by the Archdiocese of Chicago, meaning it will no longer be considered for sacred use or space. The Archdiocese can elect to rent the building or sell it to an organization that has use for it, but until it gets relegated, it will stand vacant. Quote, the church was not targeted for closure, the Archdiocese of Chicago said in a statement. At the request of St. Catherine of Siena, St. Lucie, and St. Giles Parish, the Archdiocese assisted with a multi site review in early 2024 to assess its buildings and finances. Following a town hall in October 2024, the parish determined that maintaining St. Catherine of Siena, St. Lucie Church was not sustainable due to finances and significant maintenance costs.
Mm.
Morello said ongoing maintenance and repair costs, including things such as tuck pointing, can cost more than $1 million, which says nothing of the monthly cost to operate the church, such as electricity, heat, cleaning, and air conditioning, which can cost as much as $20,000 per month. Quote, ultimately, it's the community that made the decision, he said.
Mm.
St. Catherine St. Lucie parishioners have multiple options for Sunday Mass and other ministries. St. Giles will remain open, and so will Ascension and St. Edmund. Valerie Jennings,
For now.
a 40-year parishioner of St. Catherine St. Lucie, said keeping the church open was not sustainable. Quote, I'm going to be that direct and to the point, she said. We had low church attendance. We are good stewards of the treasures we've been entrusted by God, but it's not enough to provide additional educational and spiritual opportunities for parishioners. Quote, it's not easy, but it made sense. Other longtime parishioners contacted by Wednesday Journal expressed a range of emotions. Pat Nelson, with her family, a member of the parish for 58 years, said she, quote, cannot judge whether the decision to close is right or wrong, but I do believe it is inevitable. She referred to the work of parish members who presented a financial overview at the town hall last October and said she felt, quote, the writing was on the wall toward closure. This is so sad, just the
Yeah.
downfall, like
Yeah.
those last days. Bill Cragg and his family joined the parish in 1972. He noted the parish had two eras. The first began in the early 1930s when the church was built and it was packed with big Irish families and had a school busting at the seams.
Mm-hmm.
The second era, he said, came in the 1960s and 1970s when Austin rapidly resegregated from white to black. And, quote, the parish became a DEI leader before there was DEI. Everyone was welcome at St. Catherine's.
Ever since it was the DEI leader, what's happened? It's closed.
He offered his take on the emotions around the closing. Quote, speaking for myself and maybe for other parishioners, the announcement that the church will be silent on Sundays brings on a deep sense of melancholy and so many memories of baptisms, first communions, confirmations, weddings, and funerals. All those people, all of those years, just the best, just the very best. With faith, hope, and charity, we will carry on. Tom Nelson, husband of Pat Nelson, offered a contrary view. I do not believe the decision to close St. Catherine St. Lucie Church is the right decision. This church is a place to begin wonderful things. If a house pipe is broken, you fix it. You don't sell the house. He wrote in an email to Wednesday Journal. I believe my American black friends are fed up with band-aids. Cut and run is not the answer. The incubator ideas of big shoulders and bridge cannot do it alone. We all need to stop whining and get going. No more 3-hour committee meetings. Just set goals and do it, Nelson wrote. With Ash Wednesday this week marking the beginning of Lent, Morello said the closure does provide a unique opportunity for all Catholics in Oak Park. Quote, "We look at these challenges in faith," he said. "We carry these crosses and gain some new life from this. This is an important thing for me as a priest."
Man, I hope I never meet this Morello character. Ay, look at what a beautiful church.
I know.
Gothic, beautiful. Oh,
A legacy of servanthood. According to the book, The Archdiocese of Chicago, A Journey of Faith, St. Catherine of Siena Church was founded in 1889 and merged in 1974 with St. Lucy, located in Austin. The St. Catherine's building was designed by Joseph McCarthy and completed in 1931. It was built in a Tudor Gothic style. Though the church has had a long history of spiritual servanthood, the evolution to ultimate closure likely began in the late 1980s when the Reverend Edward Braxton, now a retired bishop, arrived as pastor. At the time, Braxton and the now deceased
remember Sister
Sister
Teresita?
Teresita, uh, no.
We did a whole segment on her. She was the wild, radical, feminist, black activist nun.
Oh, I do remember her.
Yeah. And remember, Braxton is a conservative. He's now Bishop Braxton, by the way.
And now deceased, oh my gosh, had a brewing disagreement about her role in the parish.
Hmm.
Quote, she would offer homilies and
Yep, there you
reflections
go.
during Mass. Okay. And of course, women aren't supposed to be doing that, Valerie Jennings said. Only an ordained priests and deacons are allowed to give homilies. That was the downturn of St. Catherine, St. Lucy. People were upset and they left.
Wow.
I can't believe the Wednesday Journal wrote that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they understand that that's an indictment on Sister Teresita and all of the dumbass, radical, liberal policies that this parish, well, obviously Braxton was trying to keep it from, and then it yet imbibed in the end.
Jennings said that while the church was decidedly, quote, more lenient in some areas, Braxton was focused on creating alignment with the Catholic Church as a whole.
Damn him.
Weend left the church in 1991, but her influence is still there for Jennings. She encouraged me, she said. I was working in a corporate environment and she was pushing me toward church and be a layperson with a family. I did a lot on a volunteer basis. Wine died on April 20th, 2024. We did do an episode or
Hmm.
meanwhile on her. At the age of 81, after leaving St. Catherine, St. Lucy, Church Wine went on to lead her order internationally.
Yeah, I think she became, I don't know what order she was, one of these that's going to
Wow.
close like the church she ruined, like the
Wow.
parish she went on to ruin. Yeah. Was it any? It's not. It's so wild. People, you get the sense whether it's Valerie Jennings or who are the others, aside from the one parishioner, staying around like, whoa, what happened here? Is it just that population changes? No, you lose communion with the revealed tradition of the and interpretation of revelation of the Catholic Church, and you're a dying branch to be shorn off the vine. And that's what you've created. You ruined what was once a vibrant parish and center of reception of the sacraments and actual Catholic life. Well, this is the result.
Oak Park promotes anti-panhandling campaign. Last
Good
story.
luck.
Oak Park leaders don't want you to give money to panhandlers. They hope you'll donate instead.
Donate to who? Oak Park?
You'll see.
Okay.
Editor's note, the story has been corrected after Vanessa Mathany's name was misspelled. Oh my gosh. Like, do we want to talk about misspelling? Who do I need to email? We're doing that? And to add clarification on the
The fact
profession,
that that's the first editor's note that we've ever encountered
it only took 3 years.
in about 15,000 misspellings that we've
Yeah,
encountered.
we wrote a book by the time you put in an editor's note.
We wrote a whole book with no misspellings.
We wrote, yeah.
That's great. That's
The,
great.
this story has been corrected after Vanessa Mathany's name was misspelled and to add clarification on the professional backgrounds of the Echo staffers and explain in detail how the donations will be managed and used. Wednesday Journal regrets the errors.
About time.
Oak Park's village government has taken a position to try and reduce panhandling. The village has launched a public service announcement campaign discouraging residents from giving money to people asking for it on the street, instead encouraging Oak Parkers to donate to initiatives supporting unhoused people in the community. The campaign will spread posters with QR codes around the community that will link to a landing page where people can donate. Those donations will go into a fund managed by the Oak Park River Forest Chamber of Commerce, which will be used by the village to pay for food and hotel vouchers for clients of Housing Forward. The village could also use money from the fund to support people seeking food or shelter at Village Hall. The posters will carry the slogan, "Make real change, not spare change." As the village
Zing.
as the village looked to discourage, as the village looks, so that's another editor's note on the way. As the village looked to discourage panhandling in Oak Park and raise money for partners in providing housing to people in need, the village hosted an information session for local business owners at Village Hall on Wednesday, February 26th about the new campaign. Okay, here we go. Panhandling is the practice in which people ask strangers for money in public.
They
Vanessa,
needed to define
yeah,
that.
and they did it 5 paragraphs in. Why don't you?
That's great.
Vanessa
I love this article already.
Vanessa Matheny, Oak Park's community services manager, said that
And
the
former
vast
parishioner at St. Lucy's St. Catherine of Siena
is
Parish.
that her? That's not
No,
her, is it?
I don't think so.
Oh, I know it was
It was
okay.
Vanessa
Okay.
or Valerie
Valerie
Jennings.
J
Okay, but close enough.
said that the vast majority of panhandlers in Oak Park are not unhoused people and do not live in Oak Park. Quote, we do know that the individuals panhandling primarily in downtown Oak Park or in the Arts District, they are not unhoused, she said. They come here, they stay for the day, and then they get in their cars and leave and go somewhere else.
In their
We
cars.
we think it's important that we share that feedback with our community members. Quote,
They're upper class panhandlers. They don't take the L.
they come because Oak Park residents give, and we're trying to redirect that conversation. Matheny said the program has
The
buy-in
conversation.
from village leaders, the local business community, and from the village's partners on the Oak Park Homelessness Coalition. Quote, this is something we were going to have launched through the coalition initially, but we decided that it may be something that's better received as a Village of Oak Park initiative, she said. It's been a long conversation to get to this point of how do we support everyone, but also how do we reduce panhandling and soliciting in our community. Oak Park has no power to ban panhandling as the practice is protected by state law. Oak Park does have a ban on soliciting, which is when people look to earn money on the street by selling goods like candy or bottled water without a permit. I don't know.
Come on.
That seems a little backwards.
Yeah.
Matheny also hopes to raise awareness of the village's new ECHO program, an alternative police response designed to be a resource for non-emergency calls for service that residents may consider calling if they encounter someone who needs help. The program has 2 full-time staffers doing outreach work, one who is a licensed social worker and the other who is a mental health professional, Matheny said. Quote, we have ECHO here that can support them, she said. So I think that people should feel more comfortable with communicating with us so that we can help them help the community as a whole.
There you go. It's weird that they ban practices that might serve people, like getting water or snacks or ice cream vendors or something like that. You're out. But just sitting there and playing upon the emotions
We
of
can't
people
ban
and
that. We can't ban that
yeah,
one.
how could we?
That's a segment.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
What would have happened if I'd gone for it and just said, no, I'm gay. And that's Dark Notes.
That's Dark Notes. Apologies to our audience. We did not do the latest in the series of the Bob Moran demonology
Oh,
entries, but
forgot about that.
that's okay. We will put that off because I didn't want to have too much time dedicated to, or too much time taken away from dedicating to Dark Notes on, again, the book that featured on Dark Notes, Stephen Fox's Wolf of the Deep, Raphael Semmes, and the notorious Confederate Raider, the C.S.S. Alabama.
That's all I got.
Buy Trinitine beer, and we are going to see you next time.
Peace out, everyone. God bless.
Peace.